All right, so what we want to do now is touch on a really important theme that's come up in every one of our sessions so far. If you've been listening carefully, you may have picked up on the fact that in every session, we've made some sort of connection between Jesus in the New Testament and David in the Old Testament. And you might wonder what David, this Old Testament king, has to do with Jesus. And so what we're going to do is spend the next 10 or 15 minutes drawing those connections in our minds. So just to quickly refresh your memory about David, David was the second king of Israel, and there are chapters and chapters recorded about him in the Old Testament books of Samuel and Kings, and we also have some of his Psalms written in the book of Psalms. And while David had a few key character flaws, he was still someone who was a man after God's own heart. His heart was set on doing the right thing, on serving God as well as he could, and so God loved him for that. One of the first things that David wanted to do as king of Israel was build God a house, because for a very long time, God's house or temple that they worshipped in was essentially just a tent called the tabernacle. And so David really wanted to make something better for him. And so he spent all this time and money. He gathered the supplies and made the plans to build the temple. But then God actually sent a prophet to him and said that David wasn't going to build a temple. And much to David's surprise, the prophet told him that actually God was going to do something for David instead. So this is one of the key covenants or promises that is made to David in the Old Testament. And it starts by saying, "The Lord declares to you that the Lord himself will establish a house for you." So David, you're not going to build me a house. I'm going to build one for you. And when your days are over and you rest with your ancestors, I will raise up your offspring to succeed you, your own flesh and blood, and I will establish his kingdom. He is the one who will build a house for my name. So as always, you can join in the discussion here and feel free to answer this question in the chat. The question is, what would this descendant, this promised descendant of David, build? And while you're answering that, we just want to touch on one word in this verse, offspring. At least that's what it is in this translation. In your translation, it might say something like seed, but essentially it's just talking about David's descendant. Now, in the Bible, a descendant or someone who's referred to as a seed typically refers to someone who comes generations later. So, for example, Abraham was promised a seed that would become as numerous as the stars of the heavens. But when he had Isaac, that wasn't necessarily fulfilled because there was only one child, not multitudes of them. And so it took time for that promise to eventually be fulfilled. I'm just going to open up the chat here and see if we've got any responses. We've got one. It says that David's descendant was going to build a house for God. And that's correct. So David had a son, Solomon. And you can read in the record all about Solomon actually doing what God said he would do. He actually builds this house, this temple for God. But I think you've probably picked up on the fact that because we're reading this verse right now, it implies that we think that somehow this promise relates to Jesus, even though it was said 1,000 years before Jesus. But if you read the verse, it seems to just apply to Solomon because he did end up building the house. So we're going to turn to you now, Dan, see if you can answer a question for us. Why would we say that this verse has any application to Jesus?
Well, it's an important question that you're asking because I don't think we can just make that assumption. We need to have some biblical proof. Just because it's part of our webinar tonight, we can't say that that's, we've taken this verse and apply it. And I think the first reason that we believe this verse to refer to Jesus is that when the angel Gabriel appeared to Mary before Jesus was born, the angel actually applies these verses to the birth of Mary's son. So the angel is telling us that these promises would be fulfilled in David. I also think of Matthew chapter 1, verse 1, which is up there on the screen. And when we come to the very first verse of the New Testament, of the description of Jesus' life, we're told that Jesus was the son of David. That's the very first thing that we're told. He's that descendant, like you say, that would come very much later. And finally, I think you can see evidence in the passage itself. So I don't think it took going to the New Testament and the angel to tell us this. I think David understood when this promise was given to him that this had a very much later fulfillment, because look at what it says there in verse 12. It says that this offspring that was going to come would sit on the throne after he was already dead, after he was resting with his ancestors, which is really just a way of saying that he had gone to the grave. And yet, when you read through the story of David's life and Solomon's, his son in Samuel, Solomon actually was on the throne while David was still alive. David helps establish him there. And so if you read very carefully, you can understand that this passage has what we call a dual fulfillment. It refers primarily, or in the first place, to Solomon, but it has an ultimate fulfillment with Jesus Christ. So it's pretty neat.
Yeah, great answer. The concept of dual fulfillment can be complicated at times, but it really does open up your eyes to when you're reading the Bible. And I'm sure if anyone's interested in talking about that a bit more, that we can probably do that towards the end. So let's see now what else David was promised, because this covenant or this promise goes on in further detail. So the second half of verse 13 continues by saying, "And I will establish the throne of his kingdom, of your seed's kingdom, forever. And I will be his father, and he will be my son. When he does wrong, I will punish him with a rod wielded by men, with flogging inflicted by human hands." So you can join in the discussion again. Our first question is, how long would David's seed be king based on that verse? Yeah, forever. Now, here's a question for you. Think about the implications of it saying that David's seed would reign on the throne forever. If that's referring to Solomon, Solomon reigned for about 40 years. You can read that in the Bible. And 20 of his descendants were kings who sat upon the throne. And they reigned for a period of about 400 years, all 20 of them, up until Jerusalem was taken captive by Babylon. So although you can kind of see that promise is applicable to David's son Solomon, in that he did reign on the throne of the kingdom, you can see how that it wasn't completely accomplished in him. And so it must have reference to someone else who actually is going to reign forever. And what's really cool is in Luke chapter 1, the gospel writer Luke actually tells us that this refers to Jesus. And we don't have a lot of context in this verse here, but if you go to that section, you can read all about it. It is about Jesus. And it says, "Of his kingdom, there will be no end." In other words, he is going to reign forever. The throne of his kingdom will be established forever. Now, there's another idea in this set of verses here where you could look at it and say, hey, look, it says that the throne is going to be established forever. That's fine. But the second half says, when he does wrong, I'm going to punish him. And you might wonder, well, how can that relate to Jesus? Jesus didn't do any sin. So is it saying that it's possible that Jesus could have sinned? So Dan, again, I wonder if you might be able to walk us through what that's talking about.
Yeah, I want to do that, but before I do, I don't want to jump over that section that's between what you've got highlighted there. Notice it says, "I will be his father, and he will be my son." If you go to Luke 1, verse 32, we won't put it on, but that verse immediately before the one you have on the screen, it says about Jesus, "He shall be called the Son of the Highest." So whatever follows, I think, has to apply to Jesus, and it doesn't just apply to Solomon. So what it's telling us actually is that it was possible for Jesus to sin. It says, when he does wrong, I will punish him. So you see, Jesus was a person, as we're presented with him in the New Testament, is a person who shared our human nature. It was in the realm of possibility that he might sin. Now, we know that he didn't. In fact, he's the only man that didn't sin. But you must admit, it was a possibility. And in our next episode, we're actually going to consider the temptations that Jesus had in the wilderness. But you see, the implication is that because he didn't sin, he's able to sit on David's throne forever. Solomon wasn't, because he sinned, and all the kings that came after him sinned, and they didn't, their kingdom didn't last forever. But what we're being told is that because he didn't sin, he's the one who can sit on the throne for eternity. I want to share with you just one of my favorite verses in this regard. It's in Psalm 132. And you can see as you follow through it, the connection here. It says, "The Lord hath sworn in truth to David, he will not turn from it. Of the fruit of thy body will I set up upon thy throne." So you can see the idea that it's talking about a man who would come from David, that would be Jesus, who would sit on the throne. But this is what I like. "If thy children will keep my covenant and my testimony that I shall teach them, their children shall also sit upon thy throne forevermore." And what we're being told is that anyone who is obedient to the commands of God have the opportunity to sit with Christ upon that throne. And so it's just a great summary verse. And I think the summary of this section is to show us that Jesus is like us in that he could sin, but he didn't, and thus is allowed to reign upon David's throne forever.
That's an amazing verse. It's awesome to think about the fact that some of this can apply to us and we actually can reign with Jesus in the future. So let's look at the last section of this covenant that was made to David. It's in verse 16. It says, "Your house, David, and your kingdom will endure forever before thee. Your throne will be established forever." Now, we've already shown or tried to explain how these promises relate to Jesus Christ, and the fact that these are eternal promises or they're promises forever means that they're future, as we've talked about, because they haven't come to pass yet. He hasn't reigned on the throne forever. And one of the things that's worth thinking about quickly is just the connection between forever and immortality, as you talked about, Dan. It makes sense that Jesus is the heir to these promises because he's been made immortal. He died, he was raised to immortality, and now he lives forever. So just some extra proof that these would relate to him. So one of the questions we want to talk about from this verse is, what two things are going to be established forever? Yep, a house, kingdom, and a throne. You see, we're getting three things out of that verse, which is awesome. So what we want to talk about here is noticing the importance of every single word. So this house and the kingdom and the throne, it says that they will be established before thee. And what we want to touch on is the importance of noticing every word in a verse. So Dan, I wonder if you could answer, if it says that these things will be established and endure before David, does that mean that David will be there to actually see these things and these promises happen?
Yeah, I wondered about that as well. I think it would be amazing if that's what's being said. And I did a little bit of investigation. And one of the things I like to do is to look at these verses in different translations. But when I did, it actually was a bit confusing because some of those translations decided to replace the "thee," which would be referring to David, who was being spoken to, with "me." In other words, God. And so some of the translators, when they were doing it, couldn't understand how that could be correct. And one of the versions I found, the New English translation, has a lot of footnotes about why they made decisions that they did about translations. And it was one that decided to change it to "me." But in their footnote, they said the original Hebrew is specifically "thee," but it was changed to give it better sense. That was their interpretation. But you know what? I think they're actually missing the point. Because as we saw, God is looking to set lots of people up upon the thrones to rule forever with his son if they're obedient. And I think what this verse is doing is actually promising David that he would be raised to see his son sitting upon the throne. And not only raised to see Jesus on the throne, but that he would also be given immortality so that he could witness it for eternity. And if you think about that, that's just an amazing promise. And like you say, it's important to look at every word and to realize that God is promising David two things here, that he would be raised and that he would be given eternal life.
Yeah, that's great. And you can see how just one word in a verse has such important and amazing implications, such as that David is going to be resurrected to see these things actually come to pass. So it's very, very cool. It's incredible to see how much is packed into this section. So just to quickly summarize some of the things that we've looked at in this digging deeper section. So we've seen that Jesus is that descendant that God promised to David, and that he's going to sit on David's throne, and he will sit and reign on that throne forever. And we've seen that Jesus is going to build a temple, that David is going to be resurrected to actually see all these things be fulfilled because they haven't been yet. He's going to live forever, and there's other faithful people that can share in those blessings. And so that's something that it's on us to work on as much as we can so that we might be a part of all those blessings that have been promised.